Right, for all his analysis, the federal government's announcements today and a whole lot of other stories around the country, I'm joined from Melbourne by the foreign editor of the Australian newspaper, Greg Sheridan. Greg, great to have you on the show. I haven't supported federal taxpayers yet again bailing out Victoria. Some will say the politics of this has got the PM in the end. Fair amount of ring fencing around these payments. What do you say to the argument it just makes it easier for states to keep people locked down if the PM's yet again signing the big cheques?
Well, I think that's true, Peter. There's certainly an element of moral hazard in this, and I presume it doesn't provide a disincentive then to end the lockdown after 2 days. I presume you still get your week's payment. You know, hopefully they'll decide on Monday that the lockdown is no longer necessary. Peter, a fascinating thing about the infectiousness of this virus, I slightly disagree with the epidemiologists you had on there. I've spoken to a lot of epidemiologists myself, and the problem is there are no definitive studies of this strand of the virus, but it's certainly as infectious as the English virus, which was much more infectious than the first virus. So I don't think there's an absolute panic here in Victoria. And the only thing I'd say the Victorian government has learnt through its cascade of disasters is to have a great respect for its own incompetence. And one of the reasons it panics so quickly is because it has experience of how utterly incompetent it is in responding to any crisis. But I do think 60 cases of this version of the Indian variant, the so-called Kappa version, is enough to be pretty worried about.
Respect for its own incompetence. I think you're right. I think that's in part behind the panic. I was just really disappointed. You know, he talked big on Neil Mitchell this morning. Josh Frydenberg, I would have loved him to hold back this money and force the Victorians to put this health advice out there for public consumption. You know, I get that we don't put, say, security intelligence about a terror attack out there publicly until after the event, many years off and down the track. But why on earth, we're paying for it, why on earth can't we see the health advice as we're going along through this pandemic?
Well, I couldn't possibly agree with you more, Peter. I'm absolutely in favour of transparency here. Now, one of the difficulties is that a lot of things become obvious through common sense that are not clearly backed up by full academic studies. But nonetheless, it's right to take the electorate into your confidence on this basis. If you're saying, well, here were 6 cases of, strangers passing by 2 hours later or something and they got infected, and that gives us a lot of suspicion, even though it's not proof about greater infectiousness. I couldn't agree with you more, Peter. Put that out in public. But the point I'd make about the federal government is I've been very surprised at how clumsy it's been about the politics of all this. I can't see why it's not having a big jamboree advertising campaign to encourage people to get vaccinated. I mean, God, the government spends so much money on government advertising, almost all of it is junk. Surely they could have a Jacko and Gillo plus as many multicultural people as you like saying we're all in this together, let's all get a vaccine to keep ourselves safe and to keep the communities. Why wouldn't you do that? And then I'm in favour of a dedicated quarantine facility. But how on earth does it cost $200 million to build 500 beds? I mean, you can build a 5-bedroom house in Melbourne for $500,000. So if you did 100 of those, that'd be $50 million. How do you get $200 million to build 500 beds? And then why has it taken so long? If the federal government was going to do this anyway, why didn't it do it last October? I think on the whole, the federal government has done a good job and so on, but I'm surprised that they're so clumsy and that they're so beholden to their bureaucrats who move at glacial pace. I mean, I'm always on about this with national security. In the time China takes to militarise the South China Sea, we can mobilise an interdepartmental committee and write a report.
Well, I'll go to that point on quarantine because we've got Jane HALTON, who's the National COVID Quarantine Commissioner. They've all got great titles, haven't they? In just a minute, but I played a grab at the top of the show. Daniel Andrews, he claims credit for the hotel quarantine idea. And I have a view, having looked at all the evidence of the Code inquiry, that they saw this as a way to get a whole lot of money from the taxpayer and use it for job creation. That was the original idea back in March last year. And I think that's in part why there's been a a slow progress in a federal system. Let's have a listen, as I said, to Jane Halton. A bit disappointed that her report that recommended a whole lot of things last year has not been adopted.
The virus continues to change. That means our systems need to continue to adapt. And certainly, as it's been reported, some of the breaches we have seen recently are a direct reflection of an absence of best practice in some of these systems. So to say that I'm disappointed about that, I think is the minimum I would say.
Now, we know out of Canberra today, Greg, this new Commonwealth-funded quarantine site for Victoria, a decision is imminent, and we're not talking about 200 million, we're talking about 700 million. It was meant to be, or talked about, a site just outside of Melbourne in Mickleham. Now they're all talking about the Lindsay Fox-owned Avalon Airport. Maybe I'm a conspiracy theorist, but is Daniel Andrews stretching out his leave at home so that if his good mates, the Fox family, get this windfall gain, he can say, nothing to do with me, I wasn't even there, I was on leave, and we'll look the other way? Is that what's going to happen?
Look, I don't know about that, Peter, but I would say a couple of things about it, though. One, it's absurd that it took so long. Two, it's quadruply absurd that it should cost so much. I mean, they could employ project builders in the Melbourne housing industry and just build, as I say, 4-bedroom houses for each family they're going to quarantine, and it still would cost a tiny fraction of that cost. This is serious, crazy mismanagement in Australia. Why is it so hard for us to do anything that resembles infrastructure? You know, again, to give you a China example, China can build a high-speed railway from Shanghai to Beijing in the time that it will take us to build this facility. And you're really going to say that 500 beds cost you hundreds of millions of dollars? I mean, I spent my youth at young Christian students' camps in various huts and so on, and I can promise you none of those ever cost 500 million or 700 million or anything else to. It's against common sense. I mean, all levels of government, federal and state, they just seem to live in a parallel universe. I don't know, have any of them ever had a real job? I mean, do they ever done anything like this with their own money?
No, you're not wrong.
Yeah,
You're not wrong. And of course, if Melbourne gets 500,000 or 700 million, 500 million, if Melbourne gets that sort of money, New South Wales will want it, Brisbane will want it, it'll be right around the country, and we won't get much change from $4 or $5 billion on top of everything else. Greg, I've got to leave it there.
What are they doing? Solid gold tap fittings or something? I mean,
oh, look, it'll all be secret. We won't know. That's the problem with Victoria. Everything's kept away from the poor old mugs that are paying for it all. Greg Sheridan, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Peter. Great to be with you.